Hello and welcome inside the CBC Newsroom. I'm Arthi Pol. We are expecting a federal election call any day now, and the frontrunners are already in full campaign mode. Prime Minister Mark Carney is back in Ottawa after talking Arctic sovereignty in Iqaluit and making his inaugural foreign visit to Europe. Today, he chairs his first meeting of the Canada-US Relations Council. It's just his fifth day on the job. Meanwhile, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is in Sudbury, Ontario for a rally tonight. Earlier today, he held a news conference and announced that if elected, his party would greenlight all federal permits for the Ring of Fire within 6 months. That's a mineral-rich area of northeast Ontario. The CBC's Janice McGregor was watching that newser, and she joins us now live from Ottawa's bureau. Janice, Poilievre says unlocking access to the Ring of Fire would make it easier to extract minerals like cobalt, nickel, copper, and platinum. He says that's necessary for the Canadian economy in the face of the U.S. trade war. So tell us a little bit more about what he's pledging here.
Yeah, the issue of needing to sort of do more resource development in this part of Northern Ontario is obviously not new. This is something that sort of has been a live political issue on the ground in the communities affected for over a decade now. Initially, the strategy was to be able to offset what is Chinese dominance globally in the critical minerals sector, wanting to have a Canadian source for the sorts of things you need for batteries, for electric vehicles, for example, not be over-reliant on Chinese investment in the North American context. But now, of course, a renewed push to be more sovereign in developing our own resources in the wake of Donald Trump's tariff threats. This issue also is one that straddles federal and provincial jurisdictions. It was a key part of Doug Ford's pitch to Ontario voters during the last provincial election. What Poilievre was announcing today actually very much in line with what Doug Ford called for. Poilievre stepping up, he said, with $1 billion if there is a Conservative government elected federally to help build a key highway that's necessary as trade, as sort of infrastructure in and out of the communities where these minerals would be extracted. Also, Poilievre, as you mentioned, on board with something Doug Ford has called for, which is less regulatory red tape, less of a wait to see things approved. Indeed, Ford wants there to be one review, not two. Poilievre suggesting that at least as far as the federal review is concerned, it should be happening on a much shorter timeline. Now, as for why and who's to blame for these minerals not getting out of the ground faster before now, that blame squarely on the shoulders of the federal Liberal government to Poilievre's thinking. Take a listen.
After a decade of Liberal keep-it-in-the-ground ideology, the Ring of Fire is on the brink of collapse, not to mention that Bill C-69, the Liberal No New Pipelines and Resource Law, is still in place, making it impossible to get anything approved. A decade has gone by where Canada has had the worst economic growth of all our competitors. The American per capita GDP has grown 40 times faster than Canada's.
When we're talking about resource development, though, you have to consider the perspective of the people who actually live in the north. Poilievre was saying that he had spoken directly with a couple of First Nations leaders who are very eager to get these critical mineral projects going. He also talked about in the Conservatives' press release, and I think in their coming platform, a proposal to allow First Nations to have more revenue from the resource projects involved, allowing that sort of money to flow directly to them instead of to government and passed on to them through other programming. But that doesn't mean that all First Nations in the region are on board with this. Indeed, the podium in front of Poilievre, it says bring home resources. There are First Nations in the north who don't share the perspective that these resources aren't already home. I want to play you a clip from Queen's Park today. Saul Mamakwa is the MPP that represents northwestern Ontario. His riding, 68% Indigenous, includes Sioux Lookout and a number of fly-in communities there. And he was articulating the views of his constituents when it comes to Ring of Fire development. Take a listen.
I think, when I see the Premier of Ontario and also, Government of Canada wanting to protect their lands, whether it's Canada or Ontario, welcome to the club. We've lived that for a long time, and I think one of the things that's going to happen if they fast track anything, I can be clear and be sure that our people will protect these lands. Whether it's not just in the courts, but it's going to be on the lands. It needs to be done in a way where we are at the table, not on the menu. And I think it's important that, again, we follow the process of free, prior, informed consent. And that's all they want. And we need to be part of the discussion, not just an afterthought.
So a suggestion there that a future Poilievre government could repeal the legislation he's talking about, could do this fast tracking but still not have a clear path without buy-in from the local First Nations involved. Another thing that Poilievre talking about today was how his government would not just cut the consumer carbon tax, but also end carbon pricing for large industrial emitters, something he said would make a project like this more profitable, would result in more jobs. But it's also true that if these minerals were extracted and the price of the carbon pollution involved was not included in the overall cost of the product and the project as a whole, when you send it to a jurisdiction like the European Union, for example, it could face a tariff there, which would put up a barrier to exporting that project for the benefit and economic growth of all the communities involved in Canada generally. So a lot to consider for voters as they evaluate this position.